Welcome to Azure Essentials. In the next few minutes, I'll explain the fundamentals of cloud economics in Azure. Now, whether you're running existing workloads or architecting new solutions in Azure, I'll share some lesser-known tips to help you navigate the economics of the cloud for your organization so that you can optimize your operating costs in Azure based on your specific workloads. So let's start with the key question. How does cloud pricing work? Well, cloud billing is mainly tied to compute and storage, and this includes the underlying software licensing fees. Costs accrue via a pay-for-what-you-consume model versus the upfront server infrastructure and software licensing costs that you would typically pay on premises in your data center. Put another way, it's the difference between operational expenses, OPEX, and capital expenses, or CAPEX. Now, there are a few ways to consume cloud services, but because many of you are used to managing your own infrastructure, today I'll focus on infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, and dig into how the cloud consumption model in Azure applies. Now, the first thing to note is the cloud is infinitely flexible. It's not one size fits all. And as you literally pay for what you consume, for the best pricing, you need to consider how you will consume resources for your specific workloads. Now, the overall premise and major advantage of the cloud that you're probably most familiar with is the power it gives you to elastically scale compute resources in response to different peaks in your business. Now, this is great for unpredictable workloads where you can add and subtract resources as you need them, resulting in variable cost. Think of this as paying per night to stay in a hotel, only when you need to. Now, if a portion or all of what you're consuming is more consistent, for example, a batch process that runs every day using the same resources on a schedule, what we call a predictable workload, well, here we have options for that too. Here, if you make an upfront commitment to consume at a certain level for a longer period of time, you can benefit from fixed costs at reduced pricing. Now, in this case, it's like paying for an extended stay in a hotel, where you're getting a better nightly rate because the hotel doesn't have to worry about keeping the room occupied. Now, striking the right balance across both models is the first step towards saving costs. And in fact, variable and fixed cost models for consumption aren't an either-or decision. They complement each other. So for your steady, predictable workloads, you can establish a fixed cost low watermark for the level of compute that will always be used and reserve at that capacity. Now, there are a few options to achieve this with Azure Reservations and Dedicated Host that we'll explain more in a moment. And you can layer on top of that variable resources for your seasonal demand-based activities where elastic computing makes sense and where you can consume on demand or automate against specific capacity thresholds. Now, across both of these consumption approaches, one of the most important levers to keep your costs in check is software licensing, which can make up to 30 to 40% of your cloud bill. For example, if you're an existing Microsoft customer, the good news is you can bring your existing and even future Windows Server and SQL Server licenses with you into Azure, including any negotiated rates, using the Azure Hybrid benefit. This brings dramatic savings versus the default Service Provider License Agreement, or SPLA, which is often rolled into compute costs by default across all cloud vendors offering Microsoft software. Now, one tip here, if you don't already hold licenses, you can save costs by acquiring licenses with an enterprise agreement or with a software subscription before provisioning resources in Azure. Visiting aka.ms/licensing essentials is going to arm you with lots more useful information. That said, beyond Microsoft software, with Azure Hybrid benefit, you can even bring your Red Hat Enterprise Linux and SUSE licenses with you. Now we've covered the three main areas to focus on to manage costs, let's drill more deeply into best practices for paying for what you consume. Of course, this starts with understanding what you really need to run your workloads in Azure. If you're lifting and shifting an existing infrastructure, a key tip here is to not just bring things like for like into the cloud. This often leads to over-provisioning. And in fact, over-provisioning is one of the most common pitfalls to avoid. So for example, when provisioning on premises, you'll likely use virtual machines with more memory or cores than you need in anticipation of peak traffic and load. But in the cloud, it's best to start with right-sized VMs and scale as needed. Now let's look in more detail at our two cost models and your options, starting with variable costs. Once you've determined the baseline for your fixed cost predictable workloads, you can align your variable cost workloads directly to fluctuations in your business demand. Purposefully architecting for elasticity can help save costs and set yourself up for future peaks in demand, all without giving up performance. And it's important to choose the right tool for the job and reconfigure as needed. For example, take your database backends that run in virtual machines. Here you can use constrained vCPU-capable VMs while maintaining the same memory, storage, and I/O bandwidth. This is like a car with a V8 engine that can disable 4 of its cylinders at freeway speeds to save fuel. Now, because many database workloads are not CPU intensive, not only can you save on compute, but because licensing is based on the number of cores, you can save on software licensing too. Then for storage, Azure offers multiple storage options and a variety of access tiers for blob storage like hot, cool, and archive. And here you're paying for the speed and frequency of access. So matching storage types to your requirements can help save considerable costs while meeting your required performance levels. Now let's go into more detail on your options for fixed cost predictable workloads, where in return for a longer term commitment, you've got a few options to save costs. The first and lesser known option is Azure Dedicated Host. This service provides the physical service you need dedicated to your Azure subscription, which means that capacity isn't shared with other organizations. You can start with as little as one VM, or of course, once you've right-sized the VMs you need, you can even bring your whole data center infrastructure to Azure. And in fact, some organizations use this option just to get a footing in the cloud. And because you can bring over your on-premises Windows Server and SQL Server licenses with software assurance benefits, there's little change to your existing processes and procedures. It's managed just like it would be on-premises. Now, the trick for best efficiency is to make sure that your utilization level is around 90%, as you would if you own the infrastructure, to save costs. Now, a strong and more commonly used option is Azure Reservations. This allows you to commit resources for 1 year or 3-year plans for multiple services. Now, if you're worried about lock-in, in Azure that's not an issue. This model's flexible. You can pick the same premium compute resources that you're familiar with, mix VM sizes and trade them over time. Costs are then evenly spread out over the duration of your reservation. So let's put these economic tips to the test. A good idea is to leverage the free Azure Pricing Calculator available at aka.ms/Azure Pricing Calculator. Now, assuming that you decide to bring over your existing software licensing assets with software assurance, let's walk through an example. Now, bear with me in this because it's going to involve some maths. Here I've got an E16 VM with 16 virtual cores running Windows Server in the West US region. Now, if I do nothing at all, it's going to cost me around $1,354 per month. Now, if I take advantage of my existing Windows Server licenses and apply the Azure Hybrid benefit, that price is going to be reduced to $817 per month. But to get a more accurate view of costs, we need to add back the cost of software assurance of your Windows Server 2019 standard license, which at 25% of $972 in open pricing equates to $243 per year for software assurance, or about $20 per month. Now, I add that $20 to my $817 total from the Azure Hybrid benefit earlier, and this brings my monthly total to around $837. And that's a saving of $517 per month. And you can check these calculations at aka.ms/WS Open Licensing and aka.ms/SA Mechanics. Now, let's see how this affects SQL Server, starting with constrained vCPUs. Now, in many cases, your database might need the memory and throughput of a larger VM, but not the processing power that the additional cores give you. So we'll use the same VM with 16 cores, this time running SQL Server Enterprise and Windows Server Standard, and it's $5,734 per month. Now, if we change this to a constrained vCPU instance of this same VM with 4 active cores, you'll see the price change to around $2,450. Now, in addition to the constrained vCPUs, in the same way we applied existing Windows Server licenses and software assurance before, we can also do this with SQL Server. So let's continue with our same VM. Now I'm going to add Azure Hybrid benefit for SQL only, and that gets us back to $1,354. And then adding the hybrid benefit for Windows Server, I'm back down to $817. So I've effectively brought over my license assets for Windows and SQL, and I'm only paying for compute. But now we'll go one step further and add an Azure reservation. Let's see what happens if I apply a 1-year reservation. You'll see the cost goes down to around $482 per month. And with a 3-year reservation, it goes down even further to around $310 per month. Again, if we add the required software assurance costs at 25% for Windows Server and 25% for SQL Server, that adds around $20 per month for Windows Server, as we saw earlier. And then using similar calculations for SQL Server Enterprise, this ends up at around $573 per month for software assurance on 4 cores. Now you can find all the pricing details for SQL Server at aka.ms/SQL Open Licensing. So hopefully you're still following along, and that's $593 per month total for software assurance costs across Windows Server and SQL Server that we need to add back to our last running total of $310, which is with a 3-year reservation and the Azure Hybrid benefit applied. So that brings us to $903 per month in total. So slightly higher than earlier, but when you compare this to the original cost of around $5,734 per month without the 3-year reservation and hybrid benefit applied, you can see how bringing your licenses with you is a significant advantage. So that was just one example, but whatever levers you use, again, you're not locked into any specific resource configuration. You can tweak your selections over time, and in fact, once you're in Azure, the Azure Cost Management tool allows you to set target budgets and track against your spending. And of course, beyond the costs associated with resources and software licenses that we've gone through today, there are some additional benefits with Azure that accrue to business value and savings that are worth taking into consideration as you build your economic plan. For example, if you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint, studies show that Microsoft Cloud services are up to 93% more energy efficient and up to 98% more carbon efficient than data centers run on premises. And moving to Azure also helps you take advantage of built-in security and platform resilience to offset overall costs. And as an open platform, you can bring the skills and the tools that you've got today to reduce your management overhead and focus on building new apps and services to get ahead. So that was a quick overview of cloud economics in Azure. Keep checking back to Microsoft Mechanics for more tips on cloud economics, and to learn more, check out aka.ms/Azure Cloud Economics. Thanks for watching.